So what I'm going to be talking about today is React.js, when, where, and how to use it. All the slides are there right now on my GitHub account, Midwest.js. I will make sure to do a pull request to the Midwest.js repo as well, so they'll all be there pretty shortly after this talk, I would think. Who am I? My name is Brad Marsh. You can find me on Twitter at BarbecueHacker. I am a senior front-end developer at SmartThings, a hobbyist game developer. The hobbyist game developer is really how I found React, and if I have time, I'll kind of explain, how that came to be. Again, the resources for this talk are here, but I will make sure to post them to the Midwest.js repo as well. So, real briefly, what is React? Well, it's a framework right now, a Vue framework that Facebook put out that's getting a lot of hype. In the last talk, I had the Will Ferrell slide that said it was hot. It was pretty funny. I should have used that. And basically, it's in the whole MVC realm, it's just handling the V. Okay. And like I said, it's getting a lot of hype and a lot of questions, which is one of the reasons I put this talk together. Was I was getting a lot of questions from people who knew me about it, what it's good for, what kind of project should they use it on, and it gave me an excuse to do a bunch of research into something that I find fascinating, which is code. So, what are the high-level benefits of it? Well, the high-level benefits, as Facebook states, pretty much are that it will automatically reduce any kind of constant DOM manipulation and updating, because it's automatically keeping track of its own, what they call the virtual DOM. And basically what that means is, if you build your React components correctly, once they're rendered, if I need to make a change to one of them, or I'm doing something in some kind of recursive or cyclic matter where I'm making an AJAX call every couple of seconds or 5 seconds or whatever, and I get some data back, instead of just automatically painting to the DOM, doing a jQuery.html and putting something in there and having it render every time, what React's going to do for you automatically is going to look and see, is the content different in the DOM now versus the DOM that will be? And if it's not, it doesn't do the repaint. And so you lose this massive amount of overhead that you're doing right now in any front-end stuff that you're doing, where you're making any kind of continuous calls and you're getting data back from the server and you're painting it to the DOM, and it may be different 30 seconds from now or maybe different a minute from now, but you don't know which one, so you're just painting it anyway. And this is all done automatically via the React components. One of the benefits that you also get of breaking everything out into components, I just got done with the web components talk by Tessa Thornton. That was really good, as she did a really good job of explaining why the components-based approach to web development produces really highly reusable components. And React, if done properly, should produce really highly usable components. I do a lot of prototyping for my job, and having just a chat, a random little chat client or a comment client or little blog component that I can just randomly throw things together without having to worry about the framework layer to produce some prototypes quickly is, one of the greatest benefits to me for what I do. And then the third one is kind of my own high-level benefit that I hope I do a good job of explaining later. And that, in my opinion, it provides a pure, here in quotation marks, JavaScript templating option. And I'll get into more of the specifics of that later, but just think handlebars and an if statement. And if I'm using handlebars, I'm in my HTML, but I have this curly brace, #, if. The if only takes a Boolean, so it's not really an if. I can't do 6 = 6. That won't work in handlebars templating language. But because React uses JSX, which is their version of kind of a superset of the JavaScript language, you get this more pure JavaScript when you actually go to put something in a template. And in my opinion, your templates are far cleaner as a result of this. And I'll show an example of that later. Okay, what React is not. This is very important to me. it is not the all-inclusive MVC framework that are so popular in the JavaScript world right now. It is not Angular, okay? It is not Backbone. In Angular, or specifically, in Angular you have, your controllers, which they tell you how to set up, and they render things down to your views. In React, it doesn't need any controllers. You can make your own controllers and whatever you want. It's totally unopinionated in that stuff, which I happen to like. And then I personally don't view the front end as having an M. Like in the MVC framework, M is your model, okay? And a model is great when you're on the back end and you have a database that you connect to and you go, I want to create a list of cars, so I have an object car, and I can do things with it like save and update and change its properties, and those things are great on the back end because that makes perfect sense. But in the front end, what you're usually doing is you're making some kind of call to your server. You're getting the data back as JSON. The JSON really is already a JavaScript object with, sometimes an array of JavaScript objects, and that JavaScript object you're getting back is actually really a model of a car. It's the name of the car and the type and the year and, is it 4 doors or 2 doors? Is it sport versus coupe? Whatever. That's really, in my opinion, already the M. The JSON feed I get back is really already the M. And I typically myself like writing the controllers myself. So whereas like Backbone says you have to create these models, React doesn't care at all. So, you can create the controllers in whatever framework you want. Your components that we're going to talk about, they have states and properties, but they're not models, and they don't care. You don't ever have to have a model and use React. So it's really up to you. Okay, when to use it? I think one of the really nice places to use it is if you have a large pre-existing code base that's something outside of Angular, probably outside of Backbone. Angular is a little bit opinionated and wants you to stay kind of in their own little world. But anything else, if you've just got, your standard website that uses a bunch of jQuery to do a bunch of, things in certain orders, you can drop in React and React components now with absolutely no problem and no real risk that you're going to create a mess for yourself. So I think it's great for that. And then I love it for greenfield dev with prototyping because it's very, very small and I can do a lot in a very small little area. And this also matters to me. When you're doing front-end stuff, we traditionally have the problem of, especially if you're doing the back end too, the multiple mindset, meaning if you're writing, say, a Node server, you've got to keep the back end in your mind, you have to keep the HTML, CSS in your mind, you have to keep the JavaScript view layer in your mind, okay, or the JavaScript controller model, whatever you're using stuff in your mind. When I'm using React, because you can create effectively what will become your HTML in the same file, I stay much more in the same mind space all the time because I'm only ever really looking at one file once I have my server set up right. And we'll go over that later because I'll do one of the TicTacToe example I use. It's one little React file or JSX file and just a few components, and that's the entirety of the application. So I like it for that a lot. All right, so let's look at the most basic hello world example of React and kind of try to understand what it's doing. Sorry, hold on a second. Did I lose internet? Come on. Oops. Okay, Kyle is a bum. This is it. All right, we'll go back to that. Hold on, there it is. Oh, yeah, all right, there we go. I was making a change beforehand and should have saved something. Okay, so let's look at what's going on here. So this is the most basic example, and this actually comes from Facebook's site. So we're including at the top jQuery, React with add-ons, which I'll get to later. You can just include React as its own separate library. We're including this JSX transformer, which I'll explain in a minute. And then all the body has really is an example tag. And then down here in the script, we call React.render. And React.render takes essentially 2 parameters. It takes JSX, which technically is what it's taking right now, and it takes the DOM element, which I'm going to spit it to. So in this case, all it's doing is it's taking hello world in a single tag and spitting it out to the page. Looks pretty simple, right? Nothing's real complicated about that. But when we actually look at what it's really doing, it's actually a little bit more complicated. So the first question is, how is it taking an H1 tag not in a string in JavaScript? Well, it's not. This isn't JavaScript. This is JSX, JavaScript's, or Facebook's JavaScript framework for this. And JSX can take, basically what it does is it adds this XML parsing layer on top of JavaScript. And it can take regular HTML, just like this, H1, whatever, or it can take React components. It differentiates between these two based upon whether this tag, opening tag, is capitalized. So if it's lowercase, it assumes it's a DOM element. If it's uppercase, it assumes it's a React component. Okay? Just out of curiosity, I created a React component of lowercase div just to see what would happen. It just errors out. So that you can't just like go replacing DOM elements, which I think would be kind of cool. Like I'm kind of disappointed they didn't allow that. So that's JSX, and we'll describe what it does. Again, it basically allows you to create JavaScript objects using the HTML syntax. So even though it looks like we're in JavaScript here, we're not. We're in JSX, and we're creating a JavaScript object in this case that looks exactly like HTML. All right? So you can read more about that here at the Facebook docs. To continue on, basically for speedy development, one of the things they allow is this JSX is being, at runtime, compiled down to real JavaScript via this transformer. And basically it just detects, do you have a transformer on the page? If it does, when you call React.render, it passes it to that. All right? For production environments, you compile or build your JSX down into straight compiled JavaScript. And it is also possible to use React without using JSX, which, so here in a few minutes we're going to look at a TicTacToe game I built. Here is the React stuff for it, here is the JSX for it. And so if we look, again, this is the HTML that JSX can take. But when it's actually compiled, what it actually is built into is React creates an element of type div and then creates an element of type board slots, which we'll get to in a few minutes, that they themselves create an element of type UL. So you could do this the long, hard way, but I would recommend it against it. So it provides JSX to make it simple, and it really, in my opinion, does. Okay. So what does JSX allow you to do? Most importantly, it allows you to build reusable components. The React classes or components, like I said earlier, are capitalized to differentiate themselves in the XML of JSX as a React component, whereas lowercase is a regular HTML DOM element. All React classes have a render method. The render method is what well, one, it spits out a single element, which we'll get to in a minute, but two, it's what is actually called at the end of every class to put something on the page or pass something back up to a parent. Okay? Components can spit out HTML or React classes. But most importantly, that render method returns just a single component and or single element. What I mean by that is, if we come in here to this Hello World example again, and I come here and I try to do H2 test. Technically, what I'm doing is returning 2 elements, so this is going to error out. The solution that you see most common for that is people will then wrap that in a div because now you're returning a single div element with multiple components within it. Okay, pretty makes sense. One thing I will highlight about React right now is, though, this errors out, but they have the best error messaging. Like, I don't really like any one framework more than I like the other, but I really do like their, how can I make this? Let's shrink this down just a little bit. And they actually are really good about pointing it out. And it says, adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And they highlight where you start the second element. So I think that's a pretty good job. And later on, we'll see more of those examples. Okay, let's get out of here. Go back to our slides. If you guys have questions at any point, by the way, just feel free to ask away, okay? There's a lot of people here, so we're going to have a lot of questions. And then a React class, they have many many methods and stuff that they can take, but the one that you find most useful and use most often is the component did mount. And basically what that's saying is that's like document.ready. It's saying this individual component has been put on the page and is ready to go. Okay, so you'll find yourself using that one a lot. Okay, so now let's look at Hello World example 2. Now that we have some idea of what it is. So if I go into my Hello 2, I'll be nice to Kyle and I'll get rid of that. And we'll go with Hello World 2. Save that, fire that off. Now we have Hello World 2. So what's different about this versus Hello World 1? Well, what we're doing this time is we're actually creating a React component. So instead of passing it into the React.render h1 Hello World, we're actually just saying this XML, which says Hello World, message Hello World 2. So what it does is it looks for a React component, a React class of type Hello World. Right here, you can see that we create that. And then it calls its render method, which returns more JXS, or in this case, looks kind of standard, like standard HTML. And it takes its property, which a property is something a parent passes down to a child component. In this case, when I created the Hello World, I added a property called message of hello, and then which is just a string, Hello World 2. And so that the Hello World class can spit out that message. Does that make sense to everybody? Pretty simple stuff so far, okay? So that's a React component. That's kind of the very easiest and simplest React component. All right. States and properties. We just looked at a property just a second ago, which is something a parent passes down to a child component. So in this case, the parent is the React.render. The child is the Hello World. We tell it we have a message, and then we pass whatever that property is. That can be a JavaScript object. That can be a string. That can be anything you want. The other thing React components can have are states. And states are different than properties. And the best way I can think to talk about states is if you have a component that is changing its own data via a click handler, via maybe it's making AJAX calls on its own behalf and getting data back that it needs. If it's going to change its own data, a component is going to change its own data, what you're changing is the state. If you have something that the parent at some higher level is going out and making data calls and getting all the required information and then is passing that all down to its children, that's a property. That's the easiest way to explain that. And whenever set state is called, that's when React re-renders the DOM. That's when it tries to put new things out on the page, and that's when it says, is this different than it was at any previous point in time? What do I need to repaint? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. These are very important to understand. When deciding whether to use states or properties, let me just open this because I find the quote real good, and I didn't want to copy the whole thing. This is what Facebook docs say. Try to keep as many of your components as stateless as possible. Most of your components should simply take some data from properties and render it. Okay? It says, however, sometimes you need to respond to user input, a server request, or the passage of time. For this, you use state. Okay? Everyone got that? Those are two key ideas to understand when working with React. All right, so now we've looked at a little bit of React. We have a component here, Hello World, that's spitting out some HTML that says Hello World, all right? So in our actual page, we really don't have any HTML on the page, right? Because we're creating this via the React components. So the question becomes, isn't having all of that HTML contained within my JavaScript files counterproductive or even anti-MVC? Does anyone understand kind of the argument here? You know, we've been trying for years to keep, you know, the models separated from the views, separated from controllers. I want my views to be in HTML. I just want to be able to look at it and see HTML. I want my controllers to be the JavaScript, okay? And here we're doing the exact opposite. It looks like 10 years ago where you'd have a big long concatenated string and then insert it via .html with jQuery. So isn't this all really counterproductive? To answer that, I want to kind of explain why I think it's not. Here's an example of JS versus Handlebars, or React versus Handlebars. Here we have the top example. This is directly from handlebars.com, handlebarsjs.com. We're just displaying an author's name about a blog post. So we have a div, a class entry. It has an if statement that says, bracket, bracket, #, if author. In Handlebars, author has to be, again, a straight Boolean. You can't just do if parentheses author equals, not null or whatever. It has to be just straight Boolean. And then we have what it's going to spit out, and then ultimately have the closing of the if statement. See, to me, that's really ugly, because I have logic in my view layer. And what I've come to think of as the view layer personally is when I'm looking at HTML code. When I'm looking at HTML code, that is what I now consider the view layer. Whether that HTML is in my JavaScript or whether that HTML is in my HTML, I don't care. But when I'm looking at just HTML code, I want to see just code and the data it's putting out. Okay? So seeing logic in my HTML bothers me. But I can do away with that in React. So here's a React example doing the exact same thing. I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, it's spitting out my name. I'm calling React.render. Here I'm going to pass a couple of the same components, user info, to it, where I'm passing a JavaScript object. So you'll notice this is 2 parentheses, one signifying, the first one signifying its code, the second one as the start of the actual object that contains first name and last name. And then the second one I'm not passing anything. Okay? So we have this component up here called user info. We always start, whenever we're looking at React code, I find it very, very helpful, especially like when surfing GitHub or whatever. When you get to a component that you want to understand, start with its render method. Because odds are that that's where the real stuff is happening, and it may call other things within its component. But this is where you're going to actually understand what it's doing. So we always start with the render method. And basically, how it knows what to display is it goes var title. It says, does this property have, or does this object's property have a user object? If it does, then make the title of h1 this guy's first name, last name, and then ultimately we just have HTML down here with the title. Okay, so if it doesn't, title's blank. The same way the Handlebars one is, but when I look at this, what I see right here is just HTML. I have code above it handling my logic, which I'm okay with, because I view the HTML as still clean. Does that make sense to everybody? And I don't know if everyone views it the same way, but after a little while, this is how I've come to view it, and to me it really makes sense. I don't necessarily care where my HTML is, but when I look at it, I want it to just be HTML and data. I don't want if statements or for loops or any of that stuff. And I specifically don't want if statements and for loops that are in a subset of a language which I work so hard to know. Okay. So coming back here. So add-ons. What are add-ons? So when we first included, at the beginning, React, I included React with add-ons. And what add-ons are is React, the Facebook team has been working on these extra set of utilities that you can put on top of React to do things for you. Animations one, like performance testing or performance tools, testing, etc. You can see the full list there at that link. There's a really good one for like class management, meaning if you have a component that are in the component it has a div and it may have 1 to 10 classes attached to it and you don't know which one it is, that could really look ugly if that was a bunch of if statements and stuff. But they just have a really nice class component you can put in there, and you just pass it a Boolean and it just automatically adds them to the components for you. So, but the big thing here is that they are experimental. You never know if some of them are going to get pulled, some are going to get added. What they plan on doing, I think, they've said both in their documentation, is that either the ones that are past the experimental stage and are absolutely what they deem crucial will go straight into the React library. The other ones that they deem useful but maybe not necessary are going to hopefully be a separate React utility library that you can add later to it. I think they'll get away quickly from this React and React with add-ons build that they have now. I personally don't like that. I'd rather have React and then React utilities. Okay, so now we've come to kind of the bulk of of the presentation, and what we're going to do is we're going to kind of look at this TicTacToe example that I've created and just try to understand what's going on, and then I hope everyone's going to have a lot of questions, and hopefully I have some answers. So first, let's look at the TicTacToe. So let's shrink that down and open up my other one over here. So basically what I've created is a two-player TicTacToe. I'm just going to give a quick example of what it does and then explain how we would build it. So here, this is player 1 on this one. And if I click there in the middle, we get an X. And if I go back to my other one, the React is updated. So we have an X here, and I can click over here and create an O. And there's an O on the other one. Does that make sense to everybody? So we have a simple two-player TicTacToe game. Okay, first, let's look at, just real briefly, I just want everyone to have some understanding of a very, very small server that's making this happen. I created, here we go, this very small Express server. If you download the repo, you just have to have npm, or you have to have node, npm installed, you'll get all the stuff to run it. Basically what I'm doing here is a complete total hack. I'm taking advantage of the fact that node is single-threaded. I'm creating an array in memory that I'm keeping there that is my board. That TicTacToe board really is just 9 slots that can either have one of 3 values. Nothing, an X, or no. Okay? So I have this Express server that just has the board. The default route just returns the page. I have a map to board, which is just response, JSON response giving me the current array as it stands. I have a method that calls setMove, which just takes the player's ID and where on the board it needs to go. And then ultimately I have this call to new game. So it's very, very simple, this example. And I'm well aware that it's a hack and that only 2 people can play this at the same time, and I'm not worrying about any of that. So how would you go about building something like this? Well, with React, it was really very, very simple. So let me go to index and open up that. Okay, so the first thing, this is the HTML file. You'll notice that this time I don't have a JXS transformer. That's because what I've done is I've created, I have two folders over here, a source and a build. So I'm creating JXS. Anytime I would change it, I'd have a watch command that would run the compile step and put it to my build folder. So I don't have to have the transformer, and then I'm just including the game.js, which is ultimately what's created. And then whichever browser you're in, it sets the player ID, so we know which one that is. So let's look at the source file for the game. When constructing a React application, more specifically, don't think of it as an application. Think of it as a group of components. Start looking at things as components. So when building TicTacToe, what are the components of a TicTacToe board, right? It's a board. Each board has 9 individual slots, right? Okay, so when breaking, and then you start just breaking them out because each component, remember, is only ever going to return one of these. All right, so you start breaking those out logically. So the board, what's it do? Well, as I said earlier, always start with the render method to get an idea. So the board is going to return a div, and then that div in it is going to have another React component called board slots. Okay, so it's calling this .state.data. So what is this .state.data? Well, another method that every React component gets is getInitialState. Okay, and in getInitialState, you can say this component is going to have this type of state data, and you can define it at the beginning. In this case, I know that my board is just going to have an array that I'm choosing to call data. Okay, so I say data is blank initially when it's all right, and then the component did mount, as I mentioned earlier, is what happens when a React component is successfully loaded into the DOM. Okay, so once it's loaded, what's it do? Well, it calls get this.getBoard. So what's this getBoard do? All this this.getBoard does is it looks into board, calls the the getBoard function, which is basically nothing more than an AJAX query out to the server, which gets the current state of the board, which is nothing more than an array of 9 numbers. All right? And it takes that data and sets the state on the board. Okay? At this point, now, every time that happens, it's going to look and see, is the data I have different in my DOM versus what it will be now if I render everything out? Because I'm calling this .setState. All right. So when render's called, it goes ahead and says, I already have state data. Maybe the first time it doesn't because we set it as nothing, but then the second time after the request it does. And so it calls down to board slots and passes the property of data, which again is just the array. So what's board slots? Well, board slots is a React class. All right. And again, we'll start, it only has the one, it only has the render function. And what's it do? Well, what it does is it builds up a stack of slot nodes or board slots. So basically what I chose to do was make the board a div. Within that div, I put a UL and then floated a bunch of LIs left. Okay? Pretty simple. Probably could have done it a better way. So what we do is we have this array, and then on slot, but because it only returns one thing, we call slot nodes and we map over that array, and that returns a board slot component. Actually, what it ends up returning is a whole bunch of slot node components into a UL board list. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? I think this syntax is a little funky sometimes, but so what is a board slot? We're building this group of board slots. What is that? A board slot is a React class as well. Let's start with the render method again. All it does is it says when it's created, the board slot has 2 values that it needs to know about. 1, what's its index? Where in the 9 slots is it? Is it 0 or is it 8? Is it 5? Whatever. Where is it? And then 2, what does it have a value right now? Is it an X? Is it an O? Is it nothing? Okay. So when a board slot created, that's the information it needs to know. So in the render, when it is created, it goes, all right. First off, do I have anything to display? So I switched through the slot value property, and it says if it's basically what I did was player 1 is a 1 and player 2 is a 2, and if it's nothing, then it's a 0. So has player 1 put an X there? If not, did player 2 put an O there? If not, just return blank. And then ultimately spit out the display text here in an LI element. That makes sense to everybody? Okay. But here, one of the things that I really liked in the web components talk I just came from was how she explained that one of the beauties of components, when done properly, is they're very self-contained. And that allows us to, we have gotten so far away from, over the years from doing this, where we'd have an on-click statement in an LI. You know what I'm talking about? Because everyone went to, just giving an ID and keeping that click all back in the JavaScript file, and you didn't really want to see that kind of stuff. But what this allows us to do is to keep the scope down to this element. This .handleClick, when you put it in here, knows that it's an instance of this board slot class. Okay? So whenever you're doing, when you're handling any kind of UI interaction, you're going to see something like this, where in your JSX, you're going to have onClick equals this.handleClick. Okay? And in this case, what does this.handleClick do? So this is a board slot, so this.handleClick lets me make a move. So the handleClick, all it does is it calls API endpoint set move. It knows the individual index of this LI because we sent it down to it from the board slots component above, and then it passes the player ID, which is just a constant on that individual instance of the DOM. In player 1's it's 1, and in player 2's it's 2. Okay, and it makes that call. Pretty simple stuff. Nothing at this point I think is really that hard, but what we've allowed to do already is create a way of very quickly creating TicTacToe. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody see one thing they would do differently here or notice something I'm not doing right now? Well, yeah, but that's just because I'm lazy. I'm actually not doing the one thing I said to do. Oh, go ahead. Well, I could have done the WebSocket thing, but again, I'm lazy. What I'm not doing is, I said at the beginning, when deciding between states and properties, when you click events, setting data, those things should be in state. And what I'm doing is I'm clicking it, making a call to the server to say this has been changed to either an X or an O, and then waiting for the request to come back to fill in the board. What you should do, and I just left it like that just to talk about this, is that when I click here, what I should be doing is killing that instance of the set timeout and making that request automatically. I should be setting the state on the individual instance of this board slot saying this is an X, so it turns to X instantly, and then starting the call again. Does that make sense to everybody? So that the individual board slot instances, while you can get the other players' stuff updated for you, your own should be the state of what you're doing. Does that make sense? Okay. And then ultimately the last component that I created was just the ability to create a new game. So we just have this link down here that's nothing more than a React class that has a handle click as well that simply calls out to the server and clears the board and makes it all zeros again. Makes the array all zeros. Okay? But one thing I want to highlight, or try to highlight here, is does anyone see something very wrong with this line right here? Very good. Class name. Here's the thing, is it is very easy when using React and JSX in particular to forget you're not in HTML. There are these little things that it can't do. Class is obviously a reserved keyword already, so it can't use that because that's going to try to run this, parse this as JavaScript. So there are little things like this that they've put in, like whenever you need to add a class to something, it's actually class name. That's really annoying. Okay, you just get into the mindset that this is HTML with this little syntactic sugar that just allows me to add, a component to it, but it's not. Okay, and that's just something I want to highlight because, it's all good until you start banging your head against the wall, wondering why something's not working. So there we've created a very, very simple TicTacToe built on React without really much trouble, in a very, very simple backend. Okay, and absolutely feel free, download the source code, look through it, try to understand it, make changes. One thing I would definitely do is go back and make that handle click, the on click for the board slot, set the state of the board slot, and try to mess with that so you get a firm kind of grasp on when to mess with state, when to mess with properties, and stuff like that. Annoyances about React. Here's one. One of the things that we're doing in this is we're creating a list. We're looping through this map of, where'd it go? We're looping through this map of board slots, right? That's what we're doing. If I was to open my code here, or open the inspector, one of the things that's going to start bugging me about is this right here. And it's each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key property. Check the render method of board slots. Again, that's a very useful and specific error, warning message, and I'm happy it is. I'm very, very pleased with the React, messaging. But I find it very annoying that even though board slots doesn't have, these board slots are just, arbitrary things. They're not from a database. They don't have IDs or unique keys or any of that stuff. They're saying what you have to have is this. They're saying it has to have a property called key. I find that annoying. So what you'll see, again, in a lot of example code is when this doesn't actually have something that can be key, because key needs to be unique, is they just put index there. So now if I run that, or did I put it in the wrong spot? Or did I not save the right thing? Oh yeah, I'm in my source file. I'd have to build it again. That'll get rid of it. Okay. So I find that annoying. Other things that I find a little bit annoying. The requiring render to return single elements. I understand why it does it. But what I don't like is extra div elements messing up my code. And what I mean by that is anytime you get that error that says you have two elements next to each other because you're trying to keep your HTML sparse, you know, you're like, I need this here and this here and this here, and they should all just be siblings and it doesn't really matter. You get that error and then you end up wrapping them in a div. And then every time you do that, what's being created is a bunch of these React components, you know, these div Reacts with these certain IDs. So I find that a little annoying because I don't like my HTML littered with just a bunch of extra divs for no particular reason. That's just a slight annoyance that I have. And then lastly, just the one that I showed, which is I tend to forget it's not HTML. And so I create, I'll put class equals whatever, and then it'll error out, and I'll have to remember, oh, it's not class, it's class name. And there's a lot of little ones like that you know, you'll just discover as you go to do it, that can be slightly annoying. One thing I wanted to mention briefly here is that there has been an offshoot of React that's given it even more hype, if it could get any more, which is React Native, which is basically using the same structure and JavaScript to build native applications. It's not a one-to-one match. It's not one-to-one in terms of code, meaning I can't take this TicTacToe example right now and build a native TicTacToe application. The reason I can't do that is here, where we're passing HTML DOM elements, you would be passing, say, Apple view elements or Apple table view elements or Apple button elements. Does that make sense to everybody? So you actually have to go through and still read Apple's documents and understand what individual view components you need to use and what they take. But you're still writing JavaScript, and what's still being created, like where this compiles down to real JavaScript, that compiles down to real, you know, Objective-C native application. It's not a hybrid app in any way. It's just real. It's just a real app. And one thing that's kind of nice is, as of just the other day, I saw in Hacker News, there's actually a service now. I don't know if it's in the spirit of the law, but it's certainly within the letter of the law. Apple, in their terms of agreement, who here is an Apple developer, like has a Apple developer account? Anybody? Okay. You know that when you make a change to your app, you have to do it, you have to resubmit it, it has to be approved, all of that. Well, in their license agreement, one of the things they did was they said, if your app contains JavaScript, HTML, CSS, these are the only things that if you update, we don't need to look at. So it turns out that because React Native is just JavaScript code, you can actually push updates to your React Native applications that change the entire application and never have to be resubmitted. So for the first time, you can really keep an app up to date and never have to go through the resubmission process. And there's actually a service now and an open source project that'll just do this for you. And I was like, it looks kind of fun. And so as someone who builds a lot of hybrid apps too, that's really interesting. So I'm certainly looking into the React Native stuff as well. And there's the link. There's the link for that. Here's some additional reading, stuff that I've read in preparing for this talk and just in general, scouring Hacker News every day. The first one is just kind of the most in-depth example I've seen of building a full site using a React, a database. It uses Socket.io to handle, click events and all that stuff for creating a character voting thing. It's very good. It's long, it's lengthy, it's very in-depth. I would highly recommend it. If anyone in here is more like a designer that just uses, JavaScript in, every now and then as part of their day job or whatever, the React.js introduction for people who know just enough jQuery to get by is really good. It kind of walks you through, as you're designing components, how do you start thinking about them in terms of making React components out of them later. And then the most kind of in-depth, and I'm not here to start an argument about which is better, but AirPair on their blog, they did a very large write-up of why, technically speaking, they chose when rewriting their front end to use Angular or to use React over Angular. Okay, and why it made sense for them. And it certainly doesn't make sense for everybody. And Angular is awesome at some things, but this is just if you're, if your team's looking to create a new site or rewrite something, looking at the technical reasons behind why another team chose to use React over Angular. This is a really good article. Okay, I'm at that point in the presentation where hopefully I have some questions and hopefully I have some answers. So, anybody got any questions? When I'm actually doing it, I choose to do one file per component, and then I would have a folder called comments, comment component or whatever, and in that folder I would have the CSS file required for that, as well as one JXS, the unbuilt, the built, and then because it essentially spits out all the HTML in and of itself, that's it. I'd have two files in there. I'd have the CSS needed to make it pretty, and the JavaScript file to make it run. And then the TicTacToe could be its own folder or whatever. So structurally, that's how I would set it up. Yeah, actually, yeah, you can totally do that. Do I still have that? I used to have that, but in the Hello World example, the second example, I actually have. You can take this, you can mark it .jxs. When you do your script tag, just leave it as type JXS. And again, when the transformer, if you have a transformer, if you're going to do that, you're going to have a transformer. It will pick up the source file as being type JXS, render it, and it'll work. Or run it. I'm a terrible developer. I don't use any IDEs that have auto-completion. I'm probably way slower than everyone in this room. Other questions? No, it's not. That's if you're gonna start doing it that way, probably what you should be doing is in your main. So if this one had multiple children, if this Hello World example had multiple children, but this was the parent, the highest parent, I would do something like this, where this has a class name of whatever, like hello something, and then I would scope my CSS down to be under that. Oh, that would be in the state. So I actually do this in the game that I wrote. So like I said, the only reason I discovered React was I had this idea for like a card game in my head. And basically what I do is in the data feed that comes back, it has kind of global information about the game, like whose turn it is and stuff like that. And I set the state on kind of a parent element that isn't actually, it's in my controller layer, that any of my React components can talk to my controller layer, which is kind of this large, global object, all capital game. And game says, whose turn is it and stuff like that. So the React component just refers to that. Any other questions? Hopefully that made sense to everybody. It is something that everyone's wanting to play with it. So hopefully this gives you an excuse to go and try it. All right, thanks.